Gek, whenever you go live, I'll recast it.
Cool. Yeah, I think we are. And I'm going to go ahead and share it here on Warpcast. And that should be up.
Okay, awesome.
Okay, cool. So welcome. I am really excited to talk to you. I don't think we've ever talked before. So this is literally us live streaming meeting and stuff. So that's pretty cool as well. But yeah, do you want to give a quick introduction to yourself and what you're working on?
Sure. So one of the co-founders of Farcaster. I've been working on it for the last 4 years. Prior to Farcaster, I was at Coinbase. So I was there pretty early on. So 10 years in crypto this year, which is always a little weird to say. But yeah, happy to talk about anything.
Yeah, 10 years in crypto. That's OG. That's awesome. I had no idea you've been in this space that long. How did you get in, I guess?
Yeah, so it's funny. When I joined Coinbase in 2014, I thought I was super late, right? Like I was like getting up to speed on all the Bitcoin lore, really coming in fresh. And now I feel really old, just given how much has progressed since. But I was my junior year. I lived across the hall from Fred Ursum, and in college. And when I moved to San Francisco in 2013, I was looking for a job in tech, and Fred was like, "Hey, you should come and work at this Bitcoin company that I'm doing. We just raised a Series A." And I was like, magic internet money, like Ponzi scheme, no way. I had never read the white paper, so I kind of dismissed it. I went and worked at a SaaS company. And then the first year I was in San Francisco, it's like every smart person had an opinion on Bitcoin, and I didn't. So I finally read the white paper, and I got pretty interested in it. And so a year later, I kind of was like, I'll like take any job. And so joined the like business development team. And my first job was actually to get like Budweiser to accept Bitcoin payments at a concert. Like, I mean, that was like, at the time people thought like, oh, Bitcoin is going to be this like e-commerce thing.
We're still trying to do shit like that.
Yeah, I think payments is still something that they're trying to figure out. Yeah. But there's been a lot of growth in crypto since.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so how long were you at Coinbase?
I was there for 5 years. Yeah, so led the international expansion for a while. I was in charge of all of the fiat rails. Most of the fiat rails in the US that power like crypto companies today, like I was their first customer. And then at like kind of 2017 era, I ran the consumer business. And then my last stint was I actually ran the institutional sales team for a little bit of time before I left.
So when you left, was Farcaster the first thing you did, or is this something that happened later?
I took a year off, and COVID kind of extended that. Like read a bunch of books, did some travel. It was pre-kids. I have 2 little kids now, and so it was a really nice decompression from Coinbase. Farcaster is something that I've been thinking about in various idea forms, and when I reconnected with a former Coinbase colleague of mine, Varun Srinivasan, in the fall of 2020, we were kind of throwing around ideas on what to work on, and I think we both got excited about something generally in this space. And the original name for Farcaster was RSS Plus. I still use RSS today, which is weird. And the kind of idea morphed, and so starting in like late 2020, early 2021, we had a kind of clear idea to build. Pejoratively, people would call it a Twitter clone, but the idea would be, can we build something that feels like Twitter, but actually has a backend that is open and permissionless? And it's taken us, 3.5 years, multiple iterations. But at this point, I think Farcaster, which kind of replaced the name RSS Plus, is a kind of, I like to call it a mullet, like in terms of it's like Web 2 in the front, Web 3 in the back. But, the experience day to day feels comparable to Twitter. I mean, not quite in certain areas. And obviously the scale of the total network and the diversity of content is definitely not at Twitter scale. But in terms of the like core user experience and like speed, which I think, we both appreciate, like really high quality apps are important for consumer experiences. we're getting closer. And I think what's neat is like that's all happening, but from a developer standpoint, virtually everything that's happening on the network you have permissionless access to. So whether you kind of like want to just download a full copy of the network to your local machine, you can do that, or you can kind of use a third party infrastructure provider that can do that. The system does actually work in that sense. So we're pretty happy. It's taken us a while on to get to that point, but I think where we're now focused very much is like a lot less focus on the core infrastructure. I mean, there's scaling work that needs to happen there, and like there's a portion of the folks on the team that are working on some like pretty gnarly distributed systems computer science problems, which is cool. But the majority of the team's effort is actually just like growing uh, daily active users of the network, and I think that is it's hard, right? Like getting anyone to kind of use a new social product and stick around. That's the reason you don't see too many of them. But our view is, if just think of it as like for a social product, that's really important. But for a social protocol, like something that other developers are going to build on, like that is the single most important thing. So to take an analogy from DeFi, if you think like TVL, total value lock, like for DeFi is a kind of a primary metric of like how is a DeFi protocol doing. From my point of view, the single most important metric for a social protocol is daily active users, and more importantly, daily active users that other developers can go build an application and directly interface with.
So I think that one thing that most of us can agree on is that Warpcast UX is really, really good. It's kind of like the gold standard, I think, for Web3 um, UX when we're talking about something that like normal people would use and be comfortable with. And I think you touched on the Web 2 in the front, Web 3 in the back as maybe a design philosophy. But I think it's interesting to see kind of the approach that you took at the time that it was taken, because no one had really, I don't think, done that before. And everyone has been trying to figure out, what is that sweet spot for onboarding people into the space, And there's been a lot of ways that people have tried to abstract away different parts of the UX. And I just thought that you all have chosen a lot of like really good, or you all have made a lot of really good decisions. So I'm just curious, like, how do those decisions get made? Is it experimentation, or do you all have like people in the company that just have great insight, maybe like yourself, that are like calling the shots? Just curious how this stuff happens, because like things don't just get shipped; they have to be designed, talked about, then they're built, then they're shipped, and then they're tested. Blah blah blah.
Yeah, so let me kind of like separate it as how did we approach building the network in terms of like from the start, and then things that I think we've learned along the way. Um, Varun and I had a very strong point of view at the beginning that in order to get that core metric, daily active users, as much as we are motivated every day because we want to build an at scale protocol like that. That's actually coming out of Coinbase. Like, we did pretty well. We didn't necessarily have to go work on this. And I think we were both really excited about a 10+ year, mission to just drive an at scale, internet protocol. And we like to say like 1 billion plus people using Farcaster every day. That's a ways off, but it's good to have an ambitious goal and kind of see where you can make progress towards. In that world, to get to that 1 billion plus people using it, you need many different apps and services. Like otherwise, it's not a protocol; it's just a social network with an open API. So many different apps and services. That's going to mean you have hundreds, if not thousands, of developers building on top of the protocol. And if you actually just think like from first principles, what do those developers want? Tech is like that's like a sufficient condition. Or rather a necessary condition. Like if it doesn't work, obviously no one's going to be able to build on it. But it is not sufficient to actually get the quality of apps and the number of apps required to actually drive 1 billion plus people using a protocol. It's the hard thing for developers, especially in consumer and social, is getting users, right? Like the Peter Thiel, like if you build it, they will come. Is it's complete fallacy from Field of Dreams. It's like you ultimately selling, marketing, whatever you're doing that's the hard thing. And there's the famous line, first time founders think about products, second time founders think about distribution. And so our kind of belief at the beginning, and I don't know if it's actually right, it's what we've done, is the goal is to actually make Farcaster the best place to get users. And if we can do that, that will be the kind of like selling point. And we could have every other thing kind of worse in terms of like, oh, this is a little clunky, or this is confusing, or like your docs aren't good. Like all these things that otherwise I think are important. And you're kind of world class in thinking about DevX. Like, I don't think Farcaster's DevX is like as good as it could be. And like, I know the team would want to improve it. But I think one of the things we've tried to stay really focused on a discipline thing is the best DevX for a social protocol, from our opinion, and again, other approaches could definitely work, is just get people active users so that they can actually grow their app, right? And so that's been the focus from day one. So if you kind of step one back, if developers need users and you don't have users, what's the best way to get users? It's build your own app and then try to actually get users of that app and then make the actual APIs open. And so that was the kind of original reason to build a kind of tightly coupled initial client, which is called Warpcast, and the protocol at the same time. I wrote it up as a kind of like a mini blog post at one point called Product-Led Protocol Design, just to kind of like put it out there as like, this is our philosophy. And I want to be super clear. I actually don't think it's the only way to build a protocol. Like, I actually don't think Ethereum, you could say like Mist, early days, MetaMask is sort of quasi, obviously it's a different entity with consensus, but ultimately you're trying to catch lightning in a bottle in terms of like building a social layer and protocol. And so I think for us, we thought that the best way for us to be able to potentially do that is to kind of do this like very opinionated, like build the client and have the client dog food the protocol. When things aren't working for our own client, figure out, okay, how can we improve that at the protocol layer? And I think it's led to higher quality design from our standpoint on what we're doing at the like lower level protocol layer, because we deal with the pain every day. And obviously now that we have a growing ecosystem of developers, we get a lot of feedback from them. And so that it's starting to shift. In a perfect world, I would have loved to just been able to build the Farcaster protocol, no client. Like I think that's actually more pure and like would be great, right? And then no one's complaining, oh, Warpcast like is competing against me at the app layer. But I didn't actually know how to do that. So like the only thing I knew how to do is like, I can build a good, decent product that people will actually use. And I can just stay stubborn enough to keep making progress on it week over week over week and try to grow the daily active users. That's the best way for me to get to that end goal of enough daily active users on a permissionless protocol that other developers can get there. If I had a different skill set or had kind of maybe done this before, maybe there's a version where I could have actually just built the protocol and then kind of left the app layer up to everybody else. But do play to your strengths. And in our case, it was like Varun and I think thought we could build a decent app. And now obviously we have a bigger team. We're only 14 still, but like the team has really pushed it forward in terms of like that user experience. But I think that has worked well enough for us so far. It may not work forever, right? Like I think, we think in orders of magnitude, and we might have maybe another 10 or 100x in terms of total number of daily active user growth before we have to kind of rethink that strategy and say, hey, Warpcast is actually not going to ever be 100 million daily active users. And like, we need to actually think of a better strategy to seed the ecosystem with more apps, or what can we be doing better to like encourage more apps that are kind of expanding the horizon of content or, stuff that's happening on the network.
I have so much to unpack there. Well, first of all, I dropped a link to the blog post that you mentioned in Twitter and on Warpcast. But I guess the focus on the application layer paid off, I think, really well, because it reminds me of kind of this idea of people that are out there talking about like ideas and things that they would like to see happen, or when they try to tell someone or give direction on a thing that should exist. It's hard to kind of really articulate that and have someone execute with a specific vision in mind, unless you do it yourself sometimes. And I think that this is kind of that. Like you could have, like you said, built the protocol and sold a vision of what something like Warpcast could be, but instead you all just like buckled down and actually built that exact thing, and therefore you don't have to really explain that to anyone. They can just go pick up an app and they can feel the experience, and then if they want to expand upon that in another way by building on the protocol, it's now open. Unlike something like Twitter, where people really do like they might really like their social network there, but they no longer enjoy their feed, or they think the experience isn't as good as it could be, but they don't really have an option to kind of like build their own thing because there is no open API. So
Yeah, and I think like a good example of this is Frames, where Frames has been an idea that like in one version or another, and other people in the ecosystem have had ideas around this. I think in a version where we had to kind of put it out as a spec at the protocol, then convince, let's say we had 5 or 6 ecosystem developers that are kind of like the primary apps. We have to convince someone to actually now pop it to the top of their stack, right? Like, and in terms of like, there's a zillion requests always coming from whether it's users or your ideas or other people's ideas. And then prioritization, it's like, great, I would love to do that. Like, I'd love to have live streaming on Warpcast. It's a matter of prioritization, right? And so I think in our case, because we felt at the time when we decided to work on Frames, it was like kind of like a week-long implementation. Like, it's like, keep it as simple as possible, try to get it out, and then actually just launch it. And the ability to actually have it in our client, which both has web and mobile, and 85% of usage of Farcaster is mobile, and be able to kind of like vertically integrate in that sense, allowed us to actually both experiment quickly and actually get enough distribution for that at the beginning, which it ended up catching fire. I don't think we expected Frames to like kind of generate as much interest, but that ability to kind of that vertical integration and experimentation, I think has been really beneficial for us. And I think the same thing, we have a really primitive messaging system on Warpcast. It is not sophisticated. We actually originally tried an encrypted system, and the encryption worked great, but the like long tail of little bugs in terms of performance stuff, we use React Native, was just, we had one person working on it. And you think about something like WhatsApp or whatever, obviously you have 50, 100 engineers that are kind of focused on the core performance of stuff. So we actually reverted to a simpler system. And what we found is there are a whole bunch of just kind of like limitations of this system, but the fact that now we can actually move at a faster speed and iterate, and then the ability, we just added some very basic APIs so that people can actually build kind of like messaging bots. That again is something where if we had focused on getting that into kind of a decentralized format, or we'd use another protocol, the ability to kind of like unwind a mistake and actually iterate towards like a better version of that system would have been potentially impossible, practically impossible in terms of like, having support. So I think part of the benefit to having kind of like this client and then working on the protocol is we miss like most of the time. Like we'll think this is going to be a good feature or like an initiative, and it just doesn't move numbers or anything. And so our ability to kind of iterate quickly from that, or try something new, I think is definitely an advantage. And like you talk to any person in Web 2, they're like, yeah, that's like just normal product development. But I think with crypto and protocols, it's much harder in terms of like, if you're moving at the speed of effectively social consensus, or can't have breaking changes, your clock speed is that much lower, and so you only have so much time before you start to lose talented people both in your own ecosystem, on your own team. So like I think Varun and I wake up every day, and I give Varun a ton of credit on this in terms of in some ways we've been very fortunate in the sense that we're very well capitalized, so we can take a very long-term approach. But we simultaneously are taking a long-term approach. But we wake up every day and it's just, okay, like what are we doing to make progress on this kind of retained daily active user goal today? Like, and if we're not actually making progress every day, every week, you can waste a lot of time working on the wrong things. And so I think what we're just trying to be dialed in on is just stay focused on that singular goal. And we're not always going to get it right, but I think if we can get it right enough some of the time, and that compounds, then you can actually make progress.
So with you mentioned Frames. Was Frames something? Okay, well, let me go back a little bit. You all fundraised recently, or announced a fundraise, and the fundraise was probably, I mean, I don't know, is it the biggest fundraise in the whole Web3 space for application ever? I think, if I was to kind of go back, I don't really think that I know of any other ones. But anyway, it was really great to see, because I have been a proponent of builders at the app layer for a while, and it's an area that I'm like focused on and interested in because I'm an application developer. Like when I joined the space, I was very, very much sold on the idea of building these types of applications. But it was very early, and obviously it's not easy to build a high quality app. But over the years, I've just seen so many people that are just launching infrastructure protocols, raising money. It's just easier to raise money there. So it's really great to see, such a large fundraise because really, I mean, people see stuff like that as a signal that, okay, I can, if they can do it, maybe I can do it. And it's a great signal for other application developers to consider building at the app layer. But were frames around when you all started fundraising, or did that play into how well y'all were able to fundraise? Because I think like when frames started taking off, it sounded like that was the same time when you also had a very big spike in like user growth.
Yeah, so the fundraise kind of came together pretty quickly, and it was very much during the kind of big step up in growth of the network, which is mostly sustained, by the way. So I think there are a lot of spikes in people's social networks based on a viral moment, and then you have your natural day 30 retention. But I think our day 30 retention actually has been as good as it's been in the 3.5 years been working on the product. I think one Coinbase, I was part of the Series D and E fundraise. So they at the app layer in crypto, I think that they have raised more. OpenSea, more.
Yeah,
even
but those are
Uniswap,
kind of
like, but yeah. So look, I one thing is like it's great to raise money if you're a good steward of the capital. The other thing is you can think of it as like a mortgage. It's like, congratulations, you now have like a bigger hurdle and something to kind of, people are going to expect a return from it. I think the rationale for us is we're a little bit more old school Silicon Valley in that, one in hand is better two in the bush, right? So the market was there for us to be able to fundraise. We thought that it was prudent to kind of just be able to raise money and then actually be able to think about this long term. So the team is 14. We are not spending most of that money, if anything. And I think
you have like a
what we're trying to
100-year
do
runway.
yeah, I mean, look, I think we're just trying to approach this the same way Coinbase was built. And so one thing that I think Fred and Brian don't get enough credit for was just their timing on fundraises in crypto related to crypto cycles was impeccable, right? Like they raised their Series C kind of right before the market really cooled off in 2014, and that funding was able to kind of sustain the company through the doldrums of 2015, 2016 until 2017, when the company had a 100x growth in revenue in a year. So that was a really good timing. Company raised in 2018, and then that sustained them basically till the IPO. And so I think one thing Varun and I learned from that is like raise money, but be really careful about how you spend it if you're actually trying to take a long-term vision on things. And so one way to think about this is like, we're going to have another crypto cycle. I'm pretty confident. I've been through 4 of them. We're not going to have to fundraise during that cycle, and we won't have to fundraise after that cycle. So like I'm already thinking, like everyone's hoping the market picks back up. I'm already thinking about the next bear market. Like that's the kind of like we genuinely want to work on this long term. And I know I'm sure people who would be like, okay, whatever, I don't believe you, but okay, like I know what I believe. And so I think that's actually the primary motivation is we can stay super focused. And if something starts to work, like I think Frames has definitely been a big unlock for us in terms of just like general amount of attention and developer activity. But when we actually figure out the growth engine for retained daily active users in a way that we know we can put in X resources, whether that's dollars, time, engineering, and get out on the other end like a positive ROI on daily active users, then we don't have to go fundraise. Which for those who have fundraised or haven't fundraised at a bigger level, it takes actually a lot of time. And so the idea is that that's now behind us. And so for us, our ability to see something that's working and then actually start making a prudent investment in it is very much how we're approaching things. But going to your point about the app layer, it's the reason I moved to Silicon Valley. It's the reason I was excited about working at Coinbase. I think infrastructure is obviously, you can't have all this stuff without the infrastructure. But I think, yeah, like app layer is what actually drives a lot of the value, right? Like Ethereum is not valuable without MetaMask. Like you need apps to actually make your infrastructure valuable. And I think like you do have some of the projects out there that have insane tech, but because they don't actually have the end user apps or kind of whether it's integrations with exchanges, which are all at the end of the day like the way that you actually interact with these pieces of infrastructure, they have a really hard time, right? You have the kind of like classic L1s that have been around for a really long time that have amazing metrics. And I think, one great example of Solana is, I think, because of Phantom and because I think Toli and Raj really push a lot of that in that ecosystem, they've been able to move that infrastructure layer forward because there actually are apps that people can use one way or
I want to touch on that post that you mentioned a moment ago. It was like protocol-led app development or something like that. Is that what it was called?
Yeah, protocol or product-led protocol development.
Okay, product-led protocol development. What was the main gist of that? It's basically that you build protocol specifically for your own application use case.
Yeah, so it's. I think that to simplify it completely, it's you can't expect other people to do the hardest thing. And in my view, for a social protocol, the hardest thing is getting retained daily active users. It's not the technology stack. Like you can build a great technology stack and it can be super sophisticated, but again, it's necessary, not sufficient. Sufficient is like you need the actual retained daily active users to make the ecosystem interesting. And so that is the hard thing. And if you're not willing to do the hard thing yourself, why would anyone else do it? Because if someone has a breakout social app, why would they build it on your protocol? They just build their own protocol. So I think one of the things that Warpcast does is we are building the protocol. And so when we do something with Warpcast that actually grows daily active users, we know we want to build the protocol, so we don't have to convince anyone else. Versus someone else in the ecosystem, if they really had breakaway growth, they'd be like, why am I going to go listen to this guy? Like I have better ideas. I obviously know how to grow a protocol better than he does. And so I think it really is you have to fundamentally believe that we actually want to build a protocol, right? Like there's the kind of cynical view of saying, okay, Warpcast is just trying to get big enough, and then they're gonna do their own like Zynga Facebook rug or something where they're like, surprise, we actually didn't want to build the protocol. So I think that's a reasonable critique, and the only thing I could say is I want to build a protocol. I think the second part of the post is very much a kind of I think with protocols generally, I actually don't think that they matter. Again, going back to this tech stack, I think people tend to focus on the technical component of it versus starting with the user experience. And so basically everything that we do, when we think about protocol design, we start with like, and this is useful that I like live in a client every day in terms of product design, is like, how is this manifest with a user, and how do we make this seem as just normal Web 2 as possible? And so I think that mentality of start with like literally what are the buttons people are clicking or the app that they're using, and then how does it actually work its way through the protocol? That something like Frames, that is a kind of like you start with the user experience and then work your way back. And I think there's a version where you try to start at the protocol, be like, hey, wouldn't this be great? Like, let's create this primitive. But there's 80% of the work is at the lower level, and then 20% of the work is at the client level. Whereas I think actually most of the thinking and work should happen starting with the user experience and then work your way into the protocol. Which is how something like Meta, in any of their products, that's what they're doing, right? Like you don't think about like the backend you think about the product you want to ship to people, and then the backend architecture and whatever complicated systems they have, the backend they design around the product that they want to drive.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Another question, and this is kind of going back a little bit, but when you started building Farcaster, why was the social network the thing that you thought would be the killer use case for Web3? Because I'll also feel the same way, that it's kind of like, I have my own views on that, but I'm just curious what yours are, because you could have basically, built whatever you felt like it. But you said you wanted to spend 10 years or a long time building on something, building something. So just curious, like, why you chose social, and just curious to hear your views there.
Yeah, so a couple things. One, the original idea, RSS Plus, which is also on my blog, if you like RSS with the plus sign, and you can kind of see, it's like the raw notes that I was thinking at the time. Um, I didn't actually view it as like a crypto Web3. I think I view because Farcaster is relatively simple from a crypto implementation. Like, we use a little thin layer of OP mainnet, and we use crypto for what we think it's good for. It's like, user controlled private key, public key, identity, right? So that's the kind of on-chain mapping, and then payments, right? So we have a storage fee, a sign-up fee that you have to pay to use the Farcaster network permissionlessly. Otherwise, you'd kind of be overrun with spam. So that's what we use a blockchain for. So we're very much using it as a tool. And then the secondary component is like our go-to-market. Just given Varun's background, my background, we felt that this was the best market for us to actually make progress, getting an actual early group of users to stick around on something. But I think the original thought was, it's not necessarily just a crypto thing. Like, the ambition is to kind of build an internet scale protocol. And it just so happens that crypto can help solve like a core problem of making this actually decentralized and user controlled, right? Because there's a bunch of other options of building a decentralized social network that have no crypto or no cryptocurrency involved in it, but there are a bunch of trade-offs that you have to make there. And then I think that the second thing is, I think just fundamentally, I'm interested in basically things that increase the amount of just like new experimentation, innovation, creativity. And I'm old enough that I grew up in the era of when Twitter had an open API, Facebook had an open API. Like, people were building apps, companies, interesting things permissionlessly on top of like social products, and we just haven't had that. Basically, the Twitter API has been in kind of like a weakened state since 2014, and then Elon has kind of put the final nail in the coffin on that. Like, you can't get the social graph out of Twitter anymore. And I just think that like a version of the world where you have an at-scale public social graph means that you're just going to get a lot more experimentation around new, apps, services, businesses, open source projects that can now permissionlessly use social. And I think social is a core component of like building interesting new apps, especially consumer apps. And I think one of the reasons, kind of, if you think about it, in the US, there has not been an at-scale public graph, right? So TikTok is billions of dollars in user acquisition from ByteDance plus an at-scale model. So it's not actually a startup, incredible achievement in terms of their ability to go grow something, but that is not replicable for, two people in a garage. The last one before that is Snap, and Snap's really a messaging app. So then you have to really go back to Instagram as the first kind of like public social, like, you can follow someone, there's a graph, and obviously that it's never had an open API. You're talking 2011, 2012. So we've had 12 plus years of no innovation at that social graph layer. And so I think that is something that's exciting to me, because if you actually take it out of the silos of Web 2, and by no means are we there. Like, we're still very much trying to figure out, can we do it? But if we can get to an at-scale version of a public social graph that is as permissionless as something like Ethereum, then I think you're just going to have more interesting stuff built in the world. And I think that's really cool. I think also,
Yeah, there's just so much you can do. Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying, like, there would just be so much that would be opened up that you can do with that, and they're already kind of we're already starting to see that. But imagine at scale, like you said, it's just, the potential is just incredible.
Yeah, like here's a good example. Figma could have a social network for designers, right? Figma's probably at scale with enough designers that they can actually go bolt that on now. Like, they just turn it on, and now all of a sudden all these designers who are using it every day would actually go do it. So that's an example of like a latent social network that exists within the existing paradigm. But in a world where you actually were able to get, actual scale on a public social graph, Someone else could just go build the social layer and say, hey, I want to go build a better design, right? I want to build, for those who remember, Dribble or one of these other sites that kind of had a moment in the sun. But when that site kind of ends up declining, you don't lose the accumulated history and graph. Like, you can actually go point it to something different. And so I think that is a worthwhile thing. I also think, one of the core beliefs that I have that is, like, I'm in the US. I think the Constitution is good. I think the ability for you to actually have freedom of speech on the internet, not necessarily freedom of reach, because I think that gets conflated quite a bit. And obviously, if you have multiple clients and algorithms, then there is no kind of omni thing for people to get mad about. It'd be much more like the web, which I don't think anyone gets mad about people's ability to spin up a website, right? Because if you don't get distribution from Google or basically on social, yeah, you have the freedom to put a website up, which I actually think is really important. It is permissionless, but you don't have you don't have as much consternation that you do with centralized social media, because the system is actually decentralized, right? Like, and permissionless. So, you're not necessarily hosting all of the content on one server. Like, there isn't a centralized algorithm. Yes, Google is the biggest, but you can go directly to a website. And so I think that in a world where you have freedom of expression and you can actually offer that globally, in the same way that Ethereum gives you kind of like the freedom to move value, right, or Bitcoin. I think that as an internet protocol would be pretty great, right? And so obviously you have the web, but it's not as strongly like typed from a social standpoint. It's like, Dan follows Nodder is not where is that data live? It lives in kind of siloed. And so the idea of like actually kind of getting that out of a Web2 silo, if you can make it happen, I think it's net beneficial for the internet. Like, it just now you are in control of your public social signals. And again, most people won't care, right? Like, most people don't actually use public social graphs. That they're just like, the 99-1 rule. So 90% of people are just kind of lurkers. But that's fine. Like, I think they can still get benefit from it. But I think for the bigger accounts, the 1% of accounts that are kind of like the content creators, there's also just a benefit of like owning your own audience, right? It's like, you have a Substack, like, you own that audience on Substack. You don't own your audience on YouTube.
So I think we're getting close to being up on time, but I just want to mention one last couple of things. So I've always found it kind of fascinating to talk to startup founders who build over like a long period of time and see ups and downs and kind of stick with it and then see success. I just think that's always really cool to see. And then I've like also, thought about at some point in my life, doing a startup. I don't really have an idea yet that I feel so confident in that I would want to focus on. But a book that I read was like The Hard Thing About Hard Things, one of the many books I've read about startups. I'm curious, like, have you felt that you've run into any like crazy things as a startup founder? Have you felt any time during this period that what you're working on isn't going to work out? So you've had, second thoughts, or just any general like advice to any people that are out here considering, launching a startup and building, or maybe they are already doing so. And just curious to hear, your experience so far in those different regards.
Yeah, I mean, I wake up every day and wonder if it's going to work. So I think, sometimes people are like, "Oh, you raised so much money, like you must feel great, like no stress." It's like, no, it's you adapt immediately, and the same worries fundamentally about whether the thing you're working on is actually going to work. They still stick around. I think the biggest challenge with startups, outside of just obviously you hit some seam or lightning in a bottle and just like the thing is working, which I actually don't think most startups are like that. Especially talking to founders, like it is the ability to just kind of keep waking up every single day and having the willingness to try to make forward progress. And I think that I didn't even appreciate that at Coinbase, because as an early employee at Coinbase, I felt like I very much like contributed a lot to building the company to where it is now. But I mean, I would like, if I talked to myself then, I would have thought like I was a lot closer to being like what it's like to be a founder. And I would say like now I was an idiot, because I think ultimately it's like a child, right? Like you just always are thinking about it. Like if you stop moving, uh, it dies. So it like really, I think that is the trait that I would say is like just the type of person that's wired to just be able to, wake up, get punched in the face effectively with whatever problem you have that day, and then be like, okay, like I'm gonna just try to make the best of today, and then do the exact same thing again tomorrow, and then do that over the course of many years. I think that is the single most important thing, at least from my perspective. Like it is like a determination and willingness to just make progress despite setbacks. Um, and I think that sounds scary for some people, and other people that's like, oh man, I wish I had like a job that like I felt like I had control, right? Like that's the fun part, is like you get to make the decisions. Um, but yeah, like I think I underestimated the psychological component of a startup, and I'm in a position where I was coming from Coinbase, a, great economic outcome from Coinbase. Like I don't have actually a bunch of other stresses that other people do have in from a startup, but at the same time, you talk to anyone doing a startup who's actually like really intensely doing it, because there's the type of person that's saying I'm doing a startup, but they're not actually devoting full time to it. And I
Hmm.
think it's pretty universal. It's just like that's the job. And I think Ben's book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things, is a great example. And obviously that's a rougher experience of it. But I think that's, it's funny. You like ask someone like Mark Andreessen, it's like, why didn't you do another startup? Like, obviously, Netscape or whatever. He's like, why would I ever want to do that again? Like,
Yeah, exactly. It
it's
was funny because when I read the book, it was like it was recommended to me by so many people, and I just thought it was going to be like, here's how you like do a startup. But I started reading the book, and it was like one disaster after another. I was like, when are they going to start telling me how to run a startup? And then I realized like the whole point of the book is that like life is just like insane when you're running a startup, and like shit just fucks up every day.
Yeah, and I think that's like it's a good example. And obviously, he's now a competitor with Twitter. But say what you want about Elon. I mean, he's got all the flaws of any human, but um, the once you've been in that seat of like the just like wake up every day and deal with disasters, and it's like, okay, the dude was doing it with a rocket company and a car company, and then he just decided to add on like more things. I mean, I can't deal with that. Like I can barely deal with one. And so I think that there's a certain aspect of like separating different parts of a person, but I think that's an extraordinary skill. I don't think most humans are actually wired like that. I think most people can barely handle, if they can, one, and to be able to do multiple things, and that I think is you have to be wired differently.
Yeah, it's always interesting to hear the insight from the founder themselves, especially from the outside looking in. You just assume when you see like success that everything is just, oh, like I want to emulate that person. They figured it out. But when you actually talk to most founders, they kind of have the same story. But I think it's very interesting because like if you aren't um, taking all of those things so seriously every day, and if you're not worried every day, and you're not pushing forward every day, you probably wouldn't have gotten to that point in the first place, right? You would have, just not built anything that great because it's just obviously not easy. So
Yeah, and I think that there's a component of media and Hollywood. This is the idea that brilliant inventor, the idea is the thing that matters, and when the reality is it's execution, which execution is getting punched in the face every day and saying like, okay, how could I make progress today? And I think that is part of what makes it a little bit, from the people who are not necessarily doing it. It's either how the media portrays it as like this overnight success, or it's like, oh, and then it's like it creates this level of like if you're not willing to walk in someone's shoes, like fully experience what their life is, and obviously you can't actually do that, but that phrase is actually I think pretty apt in terms of there are a lot of people I look at and like obviously they're incredibly successful, or you'd say like, oh, I want that, and knowing kind of what's required behind that and the sacrifices that you have to make. Like I have two little kids. Like um, doing a startup and spending any time with kids is actually really, I think, really difficult, and it requires basically you just to cut out everything else, right? And so, yeah, I think like when you see these people who have this extraordinary success, like I look at that and I go, good for them, but like there's got to be a lot of sacrifice there that I might not want to actually go do myself.
So we're going to go ahead and wrap it up, but I'm assuming like everyone that's watching this probably like knows about Warpcast or Farcaster, but in reality they probably don't. So if someone wants to start trying it out, what is the best way for them to do that? Is it just to download Warpcast from the App Store?
Yeah, so if you go to farcaster.xyz, we put the Warpcast like client right there in terms of just like get started. We actually have a new website coming soon because we actually have some other apps in the ecosystem that are supporting signups, which will be exciting. It's actually it's a good example of like a challenge, right? It's like you're trying to build a protocol. You now have multiple apps potentially that can do the sign up, but the end user is like they're like Warpcast, like some of these
they
other
get
apps,
confused if you give them like 100 options.
super confused because they heard about Farcaster, and so I think it's like a great example of like Facebook, Instagram, like they don't have to deal with that because it's like the app is the protocol because it's not actually open, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's a great example where like the crypto purist is like, oh, you got to do it like this, and it's got to be credibly neutral and all there, and the consumer is just like, okay, I don't have time for any of this. Like I'm going back to Twitter or TikTok. Like I couldn't figure out how to actually sign up. And so I think we have work to do there, but I think there's also just like fundamental, like we are adding additional complexity in a consumer product, and just like that sounds really bad, but that's what we're choosing to do. So we'll figure it out.
Yeah, we definitely ran into some of those same questions at Lens, trying to figure out how to properly showcase different clients as more and more came on board and things like that. So I think you all have done a really good job.
Well, I actually think Lens's website is quite good in the sense that you sign up for Lens and then you're able to add the other apps. So at least is a cohesive like go to Lens and like sign up. Like that actually I think has a clearer first run experience versus you go to Farcaster and then it's like download this thing called Warpcast. It's like what? Like so I look, we always have areas to improve and we don't claim to actually have everything solved at all. So
well, looking forward to seeing the new website. Well, this has been really, really helpful. I learned a lot, so I'm assuming other people did as well. So I know you're super busy, so I just want to say I appreciate your time and I appreciate everyone else that came through and watched this. We're going to be uploading all of these to the Eigenlayer YouTube channel on a playlist soon. So if you want to share this, you can obviously share from here, or you can download, or I would say share the YouTube link as well. So yeah, that'll go ahead and end it. And thanks for checking us out today.
Thanks for having me.